We're the two teachers.
Where school is always in session.
Today, Andy, we look at the courts. For the students, one of their favorite topics, and frankly, boy, is it important because it's no longer the least dangerous branch.
Well, it is not the least dangerous branch, even though Article 3 says very little about the structure of the federal court system. It left Congress to determine most of that structure. We do know that the Constitution also envisioned an independent court system. And we can measure that because the Constitution says that federal judges, including Supreme Court judges, are appointed by the president. They are approved by the U.S. Senate, but then once they get that job as a federal judge or Supreme Court judge, they get to serve in that role for the rest of their life without punishment for their decisions. That's the basis of our independent judicial branch.
Well, we know the story of American government is the story of federal aggrandizement, that all the branches have grown more powerful. For the president, it took quite a while. For the courts, in Marbury v. Madison, not very many years after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, Chief Justice John Marshall assumed for the court a power that has made it tremendously powerful, and that is the power of judicial review.
Right, and the power of judicial review is hinted at in Federalist Paper 78, in which there is this question as to what would be the role of the court. We know that courts around the world essentially have that job of interpreting law or applying law in different criminal or civil cases. That's what judges and courts do. But Federalist Paper 78 also alluded to this idea that the Supreme Court could review the laws of Congress. And now we know that judicial review also applies to the laws of any form of government in the United States, including actions of the executive branch, where the Supreme Court or courts can determine that that law or action is unconstitutional and essentially can strike that law down.
Let's put on our thinking caps just for a second or two, Andy, and political scientists debate the legitimacy of the courts. Legitimacy, of course, suggests our willingness to accept our government's decisions, and this is a problem for the courts because they have no enforcement. One of the factors that makes our court more and more legitimate in our lifetime is something called stare decisis.
Well, stare decisis is Latin for judicial precedence, let it stand. It's the importance of judges determining legal precedents. Remember, we have what's called a common law system that we inherited from the British. In a common law system, judges are given a lot of discretion and power to create judicial precedents, like a commonality over the years. And so, yes, in a common law system, that judicial precedents, that the different judges or different Supreme Court majorities, that precedents can change over time, but it tends to change very slowly. Or, sometimes in some cases, we can have a landmark Supreme Court case that can reverse a judicial precedence.
Well, we've put it in stone, literally, the statuary surrounding the Supreme Court has Lady Justice blind, and we assume that the courts are legitimate, in fact, because they're not political. However, you can't talk about the courts now without talking politics. We talk about activism versus restraint, the way judges make their decisions. And Andy, every time the court decides now, we put a blanket of politics on top of that decision. Where do you fall on this activism versus restraint argument?
Well, we know that the courts, when you grow in power, we know that the judges on the courts and the federal courts go through a political process to be appointed by or nominated by the president and approved by the U.S. Senate. These are political actors who choose our judges. And so we know that when those judges get onto the bench, of course, there is some political influence that plays into their judicial decision making. We know that activism tends to characterize those judicial decisions that maybe change long-standing legal opinions or long-standing laws, whereas restraint is more that characterization of a judge kind of letting the law stand the way the law was written or the way the Constitution written, in a judge seeing it's in their interest to not change the law or interpretation of the Constitution. And certainly any decision they make can be viewed through a more political lens because of how they got there.
Well, it would appear to me, Andy, that as our courts have grown more powerful, we need to focus just for a second on how we can check the courts. Because if the courts under judicial review can tell us what the laws mean, and they have no real political check in the sense that they have life terms, those types of things, they're independent. Andy, we know Congress can write laws that adjust court opinions. We know that there are constitutional amendments that can limit the courts. How else can we check the courts?
Well, certainly if the courts make a decision that Congress doesn't like, as you mentioned, they can change the law. Amendments can be proposed to reverse or change the influence of Supreme Court decisions. But we also know that who gets onto the court as a judge or as a Supreme Court justice is influenced by the president and who the president nominates to be a federal judge, the Senate, and whether the Senate approves those nominees to be federal judges or Supreme Court judges. Those are major checks that shapes the federal judiciary.
We also know that the president may choose not to enforce certain court decisions. This puts the court in a little bit of a shaky ground because they're worried that their opinions won't be taken seriously. We also know that Congress can change their jurisdiction. Andy, the courts have grown tremendously in power. Some would, go ahead.
Let's make sure we mention that because of coronavirus, the U.S. Supreme Court is making a historic change in how it conducts its business, where usually the Supreme Court decisions are in private. They might be recorded. That recording might be released at the end of the week or the end of the month, but never TV cameras and never a live recording. Well, that's changing because the court has to change its procedures with public meetings because of coronavirus restrictions. For the first time, we as American citizens are going to be able to listen live to really big Supreme Court oral arguments that are about executive power and the extent of executive power and some really major cases we'll be able to listen to live. That would be a big change in the courts with coronavirus.
Well, I know many of you in your history class learned that the courts were the least dangerous branch. Here in American government class, we're learning they're quite dangerous. In fact, when all this virus stuff goes away and we hear the last message from our epidemiologist, don't hesitate or don't forget, the last word on this virus will be spoken by the U.S. Supreme Court. You can bet your bottom dollar on that. We're the two teachers. No fancy words.
No fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.